All right, so several geopolitical events around Europe are happening right now that on the surface look perhaps quite technical, quite niche, but are frankly seismic, not just for the continent, but especially for two particular actors where the attention seems most acute, the UK and Russia. Indeed, Russia has been sending warships to accompany tankers through the English Channel, and Russian submarines have been operating near British fibre optic cables. But this cuts much deeper to the core of where the continent is heading strategically, economically, and militarily. Because it's not just about the three submarines or warships. This is about how vulnerable the UK particularly is, what Russia is quietly preparing for, and of course, most importantly, how this all fits into the bigger shifts that we're seeing right now between the United States, Europe, NATO, and the Middle Eastern affairs, and globally. Because once you put all that together, this is not just about some small independent issues. They are all interlinked, and that's what we're here to break down.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? I'm back here with a quick take, more of a reaction video. Many of you liked my previous episode or take on Trump, NATO, and the situation over Iran in the past few days, so here you go. Now, I'm going to focus initially on the Russia-UK situation, but then we'll shift towards how this all fits into the context of NATO and Trump and the absurd commentary around that in the past couple of days. So do stick around to the end of the video if you want to hear that. And of course, drop your comments below. And if you feel up to it, do like, and of course, subscribe, ring the bell for future videos, updates like this. Now, the story that we're going to focus on initially is coming out about that Russian submarines have been operating over British cables and pipelines. I covered this a few weeks back before the escalations over Iran, but I don't think people have fully grasped what is actually happening here and how long the Kremlin seems to have been preparing for this. Because on the surface, it's being presented in quite a calm, sort of almost procedural way. 3 Russian submarines conducted what the Defence Secretary of the UK government, John Healey, described as a, quote, covert operation in waters north of the UK. The Royal Navy deployed HMS St Albans, RAF Tidespring, and a anti-submarine Merlin helicopter. Tracking them down, they dropped sonar buoys, and they made it very clear that they were being watched. That's the Russians being watched. And according to the British government, there's no evidence of any sort of damage or interference. So fine, that's the headline. But you have to actually look at what's being described here, and it's much more serious than that. The intent is much more serious than that. You've got an Akula-class attack submarine. This isn't just a small asset. It's not being used as a diversionary tactic, while 2 GUGI vessels, which are effectively Russia's deep-sea intelligence and sabotage units, were carrying out surveillance directly over undersea cables and pipelines that the UK depends on for its data and energy. But not just the UK. Of course, London and other financial hubs around the UK, or Dublin, and a place where other MNCs or multinational corporations are positioned for tax reasons. This is a huge thoroughfare for financial flows, technology, and so on. Indeed, when we say depends, we mean depends, because more than 90% of Britain's day-to-day internet traffic travels through these undersea cables. Around 60 of them come ashore across the UK coastline, particularly in places like East Anglia and the southwest. So on top of that, you've got the gas pipelines as well, like the 724-mile Langlead pipeline from Norway. That supplies roughly 77% of the UK's imported gas, 77%. So this isn't some set of peripheral infrastructure. This is the backbone of the British Isles economy, communications, and energy system. Now, what makes this much more concerning, and why I decided to delay an interview video to make this sort of more of a quick take, is what the GUGI element actually is. You see, this isn't just another naval division. It's so secretive, it reports directly to the Russian defense minister and to Putin himself. Its headquarters are in St. Petersburg, but it operates out of the Arctic in bases like Olenia Bay on the Kola Peninsula, alongside Russia's strategic nuclear submarine fleet. Its entire purpose is underwater surveillance, reconnaissance, and sabotage, and crucially, operating at extreme depths where very few countries, apart from the US, can really match it. So we're talking about a miniature, uncrewed submarine that can be deployed covertly, often at night from vessels like the Yantar, which I covered a few months ago when lasers were fired at British aircraft when they came to observe and pressure them to, well, sort of disperse, if you like. So these systems can physically cut cables, or in some cases actually tap them, meaning that they can then intercept or monitor data flows without necessarily destroying anything. So when the government is saying that no damage has been done, I mean, that misses the point entirely, because the objective here isn't necessarily immediate destruction. It's about mapping, probing, testing. What Putin and the Kremlin have been doing, say, in the eastern flank of NATO late last year. It's about understanding where these cables are, how they're being defended, how quickly, of course, the Royal Navy responds, like how quickly NATO responded or didn't to the probes in September, what assets get deployed, how long it takes to detect them, and, of course, what kind of countermeasures are being used. That's what preparation looks like. And in a conflict scenario, the expectation, and this is something NATO has been increasingly worried about, is that Russia would attempt to sever or disrupt as much of this infrastructure as possible, potentially activating devices that may have already been pre-positioned in advance. Now, this is where the UK response gets, to use a British word, interesting, or perhaps more of an appropriate word, alarming. Healy has directly addressed Putin, saying that we see you, making it very clear that the UK is watching the movements and that Russia's not being very covert, that the operation has been exposed, that the UK has been tracking them hour by hour. And that does matter, because signalling awareness is part of any deterrence strategy. But let's not kid ourselves here. Multiple people have pointed out that even while being monitored, these submarines likely still have gathered valuable data. And because under international law, as long as they're operating in international waters, there's very little you can do to stop them, especially considering the state of adherence to international law right now. Now, in principle, you can shadow them, you can observe, you can signal, but you can't intervene in any meaningful way. So the idea that simply detecting them neutralizes the threat is completely misreading and frankly ridiculous. It doesn't. It just means we're aware of it. But if you're aware of something you're not going to do anything about, then what purpose does that serve? And this is where it fits into the broader pattern. Hybrid warfare. Of course, that's a bit of a generic term, but the point is that these actions are hostile. They're clearly deliberate, but fall just short of an overt act of war. They're clandestine, and what Russia does so well. They're deniable, ambiguous, the plausible deniability that Russia, like Iran, likes to utilize so often, such as in election interference. Russia has been accused of doing this for years, as we know, be it sabotage attempts on Polish railways, cyber operations, interference with infrastructure, and this is essentially the underwater version of that. But what's most significant, I think, is how differently European countries are reacting to this broader moment. Because this isn't happening in isolation. It's been happening alongside the US-Iran war, rising the tensions in the Middle East and increasing that pressure on NATO. And here, France, I think, is worth noting. They have taken a very different approach to both the US and to maritime security more broadly, and especially to the UK. Paris has essentially refused to be pulled into American-led escalation in the Gulf. It has explicitly said that NATO is not designed for operations like securing the Strait of Hormuz, warning that doing so could breach international law, but they have been willing to militarize and prepare assets such as the Gulf carrier or aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle as a way to demonstrate their posturing, to demonstrate they're willing to defend their interests, but also broader Europe, something that Britain is not doing. Indeed, in our case, our flagship warship, HMS Dragon, has to be called back into Portsmouth because of a water issue. Literally, sailors and those on board cannot use the systems because the water isn't working. And so this is an embarrassment. It is a laughingstock, to the point where even the Financial Times is stating that Britain has to accept that it's no longer a global power. So you've got this contrast emerging. France is asserting strategic autonomy. It is defining its own rules, its own limits, and its own framework for action, taking it upon itself to lead Europe as a collective entity in collective defence. Conversely, the UK is stuck somewhere in between. It's still rhetorically aligned with the United States, still talking tough on Russia, but materially constrained in what it can actually do, whether that's in the Gulf or even in its own backyard in the North Atlantic. And that is a very uncomfortable part here, because when you strip away the rhetoric that we see you, the serious consequences, this press conference tone, which is an important step. I think it's good for the British government to be communicating with the British public. However, you start to see a country that is increasingly constrained in its ability to respond to this kind of threat. Effectively, you've basically got many officials openly questioning how the UK is going to dig itself out of what has been described as a nadir of maritime security. And we're pointing to a very real issue here, that decommissioned ships like RAF Wave Knight and Wave Ruler, stretched resources, limited capacities to sustained operations, and inability to gain more troops to join the military. These are all massive issues. And it's the uncomfortable truth, because the UK cannot physically secure all of this undersea infrastructure. No country really can. There are over 600 undersea cables globally, stretching across 870,000 miles. These are complex, hard to detect environments, and submarines are specifically designed to minimize noise, reduce magnetic signatures, avoid detection. And even if you know they're there, that doesn't mean you can stop them from doing what they're doing. So in essence, there's a growing gap here between how Britain is talking about its role in the world, the tough talk from Keir Starmer even today, and what can actually be delivered in practice, the policies. And that gap is starkly visible now, comfortably visible. And it ties in to something bigger, as I said, Britain's overall role in the world and its relationship to Europe and, of course, NATO. There's been this lingering idea, at least in the UK, for example, that somehow the UK could be a bridge between Europe and the United States. Project power, act alone, maintain influence. But events like this really do demonstrate that isn't the case. Economics, geopolitics, or domestic politics are all pointing to the same direction. Brexit has imposed real costs on the UK. 8% of GDP has been lost. Opinion is shifting, and majority now believe that leaving the EU was a mistake and have done for some time. Simultaneously, the strategic environment about the UK is deteriorating. As Russia continues these probes, Trump's comments over threatening to leave NATO are only intensifying. And so the question becomes, what does the UK, but by extension, Europe do? Because overall, Europe has its potentials, but it also has its limitations. In terms of troop numbers, industrial capacity, sustained military production, they are all there. But it doesn't necessarily have the political will or capital to do so yet. Now, if you consider the collective cooperation that countries like Germany, Finland, Poland, France, and the UK have together, then that is a serious deterrent. And that's where all of this converges, because the submarine incident, the Iran war, the fractures inside NATO, the divergence between the United States and Europe, this is all coming to a head, and they're all pointing to the same underlying shift. A move away from a US-led system, which, well, Britain especially could therefore play as a much more senior partner in Europe, instead of being the junior lapdog to the United States. Perhaps it is time, and I certainly think it is, as someone born in this country and associated with it very closely, is the time. In these kinds of environment, we can't act in a way that we would like things to be, but we have to respond and act as they actually are. And why Trump's comments over NATO, as I will end on with this segment, are so absurd. Trump has said that he will leave NATO, that NATO is going to be punished, because once he realizes that he can't leave NATO because of the National Defense Authorization Act established in 2024 by Congress, he's actually constrained, needing to gain 2/3 vote of Congress to do such that. Therefore, he shifts to this emphasis of punishment, punitive measures to get NATO to create some kind of Strait of Hormuz coalition. And once that begins to be more refined in terms of what do you mean punish, well, that means simply repositioning troop numbers from one set of countries to another, which is absolutely pointless because it doesn't change the overall strategic architecture of NATO. Closing a couple of bases, I think Spain and Germany have been forefronted the most, and opening them in Eastern Europe, well, again, interesting idea, but completely absurd and very Trump-esque, mainly because they simply will cost the US taxpayer more money. That's not going to be a cost for the European taxpayer. But also, if he's going to reposition them closer to Russia, right? More of Eastern Europe has been willing to support Trump's actions over Iran than Western Europe. Well, that's only going to bolster NATO's eastern flank and, frankly, be a greater deterrent to Russia than it was in the first place, which, for someone like Trump who wants to improve relations or normalize relations with Russia, is completely the opposite of what you would do, demonstrating once again that this guy has the strategic vision of a 5-year-old, someone who can't look past what they had for lunch and what they fancy having for tea, or whether or not they want another scoop of ice cream. Bottom line is that things are moving quite quickly, and I do think that some kind of European coalition over the Strait of Hormuz will occur as a way to perhaps placate Trump and ultimately keep the United States somehow in NATO. Ultimately, it is within the interests of Europe to help securitize the waterways, but I am more confident that Europe will be absolutely certain in emphasizing that it's based on their terms and not ones purely dictated to by Trump. But we'll have to wait and see. That's everything from me today, guys. If you enjoyed the video, then do give it a like, subscribe. It's free, but it helps massively. And do obviously drop your comments below and look out for the future upcoming videos, including a great episode tomorrow on the relationship of Russia and Ukraine in the context of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and as well the upcoming interviews with General Wesley Clark and more in person. I'll be in New York next week. We'll see you then. Take care.